Hello and welcome. My name's Travis Miner with Open Door Education, and I am joined today by Allison Matlack of Matlack Educational Consulting. And we are here today to debunk some myths about independent schools. And I'm wondering if we could start by just clarifying, what do we mean when we say independent schools?
That's a great question, Travis. And I think it's informally changing a little bit, but independent schools are run with an independent board. They're not overseen by the government or get government funding. Moving into this field are the Catholic schools, for example, which are starting to look a lot more like independent schools in terms of the testing that they're requiring for entry. They're taking the same applications on the same platforms. They're starting to offer similar curriculums. So they are not technically independent schools because they're under the oversight of a church, but they're starting to play more actively in this independent school field.
Interesting. And when we think of the term private schools, would private schools fall under the category of independent schools, or is that something separate?
We say the word independent school because it refers to their independence from oversight from it. I don't know how to say it. There's no oversight of a government. They have an independent board of trustees that is overseeing them.
Gotcha.
So that's why we use the word independent.
All right. Very helpful. Thank you. Let's start with our first myth, and this might be the first thing that a lot of folks are thinking. Only rich kids go to private schools. Is that true?
Rich kids do go to private schools. So do some students who are living at the poverty line and below, which people may not be aware of. So in the past, it did look like a place where predominantly rich kids went, and they were fed off to some of the elite colleges like Harvard and Yale. But that is very much changing as schools are realizing they have a responsibility to educate all qualified students for their schools. So at most independent schools, you'll see an awful lot of diversity, socioeconomic, religious, ethnic, students coming from all kinds of backgrounds. So at a typical independent school nationwide, about 33% of the students are students of color. Many students get financial aid. It's a pretty rich group of students. There are certainly some fabulously wealthy families at independent schools that tend to be higher profile, but do know that schools are actively reaching out to find those wonderful students who are very deserving and who are qualified to be at their schools, who come from varied backgrounds.
And I think as an extension, often we might think that we assume that there isn't socioeconomic diversity. And another myth that I hear people saddled with is that independent schools don't have much diversity.
They have a lot of diversity. When you look at independent boarding schools, for example, right away you have students coming from all over the world. So a very richly diverse community. But all schools are drawing students from different communities. So rather than going to school with students who are from the same town, you're going to schools with students from 20, 30 different surrounding towns if it's a day school, and of course a boarding school around the world and around the country. So real diversity of thought, real diversity of experience that makes that educational experience very, very rich.
Interesting. It sounds like it's important that we're thinking about many different types of diversity too when we consider what that might look like in the school environment.
Exactly. There is all kinds of diversity. We haven't talked about things like sexual orientation or specific talents and interests, but schools can craft their clientele. They can craft their community. And so they are intentionally looking for students who bring all kinds of experiences, expertise, talents to their community.
Interesting. That's a consideration I hadn't thought of, that they are making conscious choices about what their student body looks like, as opposed to a public school that may simply serve the geographic region.
Exactly. And you're seeing, increasingly schools are hiring diversity, equity, and inclusion directors to support students who come from all these different backgrounds. It's a very exciting time.
Now, a totally separate, or maybe largely separate myth that I've heard spread is that independent schools don't meet the needs of students with IEPs. What are your thoughts on that?
Independent schools aren't required to meet the needs of students on IEPs, and for that reason, sometimes an independent school isn't the right match for a student. That said, there are independent schools that have all kinds of students they are successful with. And some independent schools have very robust academic support programs where students might meet with a learning specialist 1, 2, 3, 4 times a week for support with executive function, with time management, or with even subject-specific skills. So they can get very, very good personalized attention at an independent school. But families need to know that schools aren't required to fulfill those IEP requirements. And they need to be savvy about who is on the learning staff if they have the qualifications to work with their child and their child's needs. So for example, if their child has dyslexia, it would be prudent to find out if there's somebody with Orton Gillingham training, for example, on that academic support team. But students with all kinds of learning abilities, habits, patterns can find a school where there is the right kind of support for them.
Interesting. It's helpful to know that for parents, it sounds like it's really important to do their due diligence, to ask some of these questions based on what they know about their students' learning style, to make sure the supports are there.
That's right. And I think that virtually all independent schools will start by saying that the first line of defense is always the classroom teacher. And they'll always say to the student, if you need help, go talk to your teachers. And those teachers are available. And often the school will block out one period of the day when the teachers are in their classrooms for the students to go and get that kind of help, whether it's reviewing a paper or preparing for a test or a quiz or just checking in. That's expected. There are layers of support. There's an advisor who can help with the social support, help the student adjust, find opportunities for leadership or growth. And then there's this other layer of academic support, which in some schools is pretty light, and in some schools is very intensive and in fact woven into their academic program.
Now, another myth that I hear, and I feel like this may even go back to some of the movies that have been popular about independent schools over the days. Are independent schools just for jocks?
No, they're not just for jocks. You may hear about students who take a PG year, athletes who want to have one extra year. This has become more common during the pandemic when students they missed a season, so they can have an extra year now to make up that season and still qualify to be a D1 athlete by NCAA standards. So there's always been the PGs, those big burly boys who go off to play another year of football or hockey, or the girls who go off to play another year of soccer, to be recruited to gain strength, to gain skill, sometimes to gain muscle mass. But many students are looking for schools because they want more academic rigor, or maybe they want a stronger artistic program. Maybe they want a great musical theater program. There's all kinds of reasons why schools can meet the needs of a student who has different talents and interests. They do, for the most part, require some sort of after-school activity, often shorthand called a sport. But a sport can be yoga. A sport can be sometimes a ropes course. Sometimes a sport can be community service. So when we hear about sports, it's really shorthand for an after-school activity at many schools.
It's helpful to hear how that definition is broader than we might first assume it to be.
That's right.
Now, one of the things that
I'm sorry to interrupt. I do want to say one thing that's important to note about independent schools sports is that it's personally heartbreaking to me that at many of the public schools, students who are not really, really strong athletes will be moved out of their athletic program at their high school because there's just no place for a junior to be on a JV team or a varsity team if they're not that good. So they won't. There's no space for them. At independent school, any student can play any sport they want at any level for 4 years. That's encouraged. There's always a spot for them on a team. They may not make the varsity, but they can still play tennis or hockey or lacrosse. It will just be at a different level.
That is news to me. And so in a way, it's maybe even more for people who aren't jocks, but still want to be part of that experience.
That's right. There are certainly many students who would just love to keep playing their sport, even if they're not varsity level. And it's wonderful they have that opportunity.
Now, one of the associations so many of us have, myself included, is that independent schools feel like sort of an exclusive place and that the barriers to entry are high. And so I think many of us have an assumption that you can't really get into an independent school if you're not connected in some way. What do you think about that assumption?
That's a really tricky one. I'm aware of people's thoughts about barriers to entry, and schools are working really hard to have a more open door policy. They're really trying to get families onto campuses. In fact, the families they have the hardest time reaching are the middle class families. Because they're actively reaching out through programs to those students in lower socioeconomic brackets, and the affluent families know about independent schools. But that middle population of families thinks that independent school is not right for them, when in fact it really is. This myth that you need to know somebody to get in, certainly I work with plenty of families who say, well, my brother went to this school, or I know the head of the board of trustees, or I'm friendly with the Latin teacher. Everybody seems to have some kind of connection. Sometimes those connections can move the needle. Most often it doesn't. It doesn't. Independent schools want to make sure that they are finding new families, deserving families, and not drawing from the same pool. That's part of their mission. So I think you always have to be sort of careful about that and what people say. Often those connections are noted, but don't do much to change the admissions decision. Right.
I wonder if there's some confirmation bias there, that people who had a connection and happened to get in believe that one caused the other, but maybe that's not necessarily the case as often.
Not necessarily true. It does happen. I mean, we can't overlook that, right? But I wouldn't let that discourage anyone from applying. You don't have to be connected at all.
One last myth for us to dig into, getting into the question of cost, that I think we often think of independent schools as being expensive, and especially if a family lives in a district where they feel like they're already paying local taxes that are supporting a strong public school system. I think some people assume that they pay a lot for independent schools, but they don't really get much more than they would at their local public school. Is that true?
I think that independent school education tuition is strong. People will save for their child's college education. They don't typically save for their child's independent school education. And so when they realize they might want an independent school education, they don't have that money in reserve. And it's significant, and it will tax their college funds sometimes. But I will say that there's tremendous value to independent schools that goes largely unnoticed by some families. So for example, a personal story is independent schools class sizes are on average 16 students. At public school, it's much larger than that. When you have 16 students, that means you can get everyone in that classroom talking, and you know each student personally, and they're all engaged. When I taught English at a boarding school in Pennsylvania, for example, my students turned in an essay every single Friday, and it was returned to them every single Monday, and they had until Wednesday to revise it, and then Friday another essay was due. They got comments on it on Monday, and on we went for the whole semester. So they were writing a lot. And the only way to get better as a writer is to write and get feedback. And no one of those essays counted for a whole lot because there are so many of them, but it was a very iterative process. I could only do that because I only had 16 students. I couldn't have done that had I had 30 students in each class. So it's the smallness of that class and the community that builds. But then beyond that, and beyond the sports options that I described earlier, independent schools will bring in speakers who are politicians, authors, medical professionals, people who have really interesting backgrounds and experiences to share with students. So there's that richer environment there. They'll put on 3 theater productions a year, usually a musical that all students are welcome to be involved in. So there is that. And high school students tend to not be involved in clubs if they play sports, because clubs and sports happen at the same time. And independent schools, they don't happen at the same time. There's a time in the day for clubs to meet. So students can do Model UN, or they can join the chess club, or they can join the Harry Potter club, or the French club if they want to. And those things don't conflict. So there's ways for them to pursue their own interests. I would say that the robust extracurricular offerings are not to be overlooked. I mentioned ropes courses and yoga and dance, but there's also just wonderful opportunities for community service, wonderful opportunities to do peer tutoring. There's just so much happening after the school day. And then I would say that some of the resources the independent schools have are phenomenal, rival some colleges. There are some maker spaces or invention spaces that have amazing tools and resources for students to go and do some CAD design, do some building, do some soldering. So they have some really good experiences. And finally, I guess I should say is that schools often offer travel. So over March vacation, they usually have 2 weeks in March, they'll go abroad with a bunch of students for either a cultural trip or a service trip. So it's not just the 8 to 3 school day that parents are paying for. It's all of the other things that are offered.
There are so many different dimensions for us to think about when we consider what that choice of where a child goes to school might include, and the quality of the time in the classroom. Not because the teachers in a public school environment aren't fantastic, but maybe in independent school, they are better set up for success because of class sizes or the resources available to them.
Well, that's great. And Tyler, I don't know if I ever told you this, Travis, but I went to a public school, and it was a deliberate choice. I grew up in Andover, right? And there's Phillips Andover, the beacon shining down the street from me. But for me, my public school was the right choice because I wanted to be in the marching band. I just loved marching band. And Phillips Andover, as wonderful as it is, and all the resources it has, didn't have a marching band. And I wanted to be on the swim team. I was a swimmer. And the pool at Phillips Academy was terrible at that time. It's about to be state-of-the-art Olympic size. It should open any day now. But when I was in high school, it was a very small, very tiny, crowded pool. And the pool my high school swam in was much better. I loved my public high school experience. I think it was terrific. And I think families should always keep that in the mix, because sometimes the public school is absolutely the right place for a family. There's no question about it. And I think every year about 10% of the families I work with will choose the public school option. But at least they've explored what the other opportunities are, and they understand what they're saying no to, and they feel even better then about choosing their public school.
I so appreciate how in your story in particular, it comes down to what does the student really want and need? Where will they be happiest? Where can they have the experiences that feel important to them? Which seems like a pretty darn good North Star to have when deciding what school choice is best for your student.
It's a wonderful North Star. And I would encourage families every year to sort of look at their child and their child's growth trajectory and say, are we still in the right place? And are they in a place where their skills and talents are going to be nurtured and where they will thrive? And look around. If the answer is no, look around. There are wonderful options out there.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspective and expertise. If a family is thinking about options for their student, they're considering independent schools, and they want to reach out to talk to you, what would be the best way for them to get in touch?
I encourage them to go to my website, Matlack Educational Consulting. Matlack has 2 A's in it, or call me at 781-640-7360. I'm always happy to just talk about the process and independent schools in general if people are really just wanting to get their toes a little bit wet with this process. Thank you very much, Travis, for your time today. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you too. Bye, Allison.
Bye-bye.